Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us as we close out our 2021 webinar series. As part of our effort to support the oversight community, we developed our webinar series where for the last 7 years we have brought you information on the practice of civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and important work being done in the arena of criminal justice reform. Thank you for joining us today as we welcome Jermaine Defoe and Jennifer Jarrett to discuss investigation and analyzation of use of force. Before I turn things over, I'd like to remind all of you that you have entered today's call in listen-only mode. During the session, however, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have for our speakers. Those questions will then be posed to them following their presentations. Also, I'd like to remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the NACOLE website at a later date. With that, I will hand things over to Dan Boda. Dan is a research fellow in the policing program at the Vera Institute of Justice, where he works on police transparency and accountability. He contributes to their work with community-based organizations on assessing police data and also examining racial and other disparities as part of Vera's arrest trends work. We are also fortunate enough to have Dan, as well as Jennifer and Jermaine, as members of NACOLE's Training, Education, and Standards Committee. Dan?
Of course, I was muted. Good afternoon, everybody, or morning, depending on your location. As Cami said, I'm Dan Boda from the NACOLE Training, Education, and Standards Committee. Just quickly before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to briefly make two quick announcements. One, registration is open for the in-person component of the 2021 NACOLE Annual Conference. You can register on the website, nacole.org. That's NACOLE.org. It'll be held December 12th through 16th in Tucson, Arizona. The schedule and registration are all up on the website. Second, just while you're there on the website, there's a recent report issued that is worth taking a look at called The Evolution and Growth of Civilian Oversight, Key Principles and Practices for Effectiveness and Sustainability. And there are other great resources on the website for civilian oversight agencies, whether already established or in the process of being formed. So I'll now move on to introduce today's webinar, Investigating and Analyzing Use of Force. Effective investigation and analysis of use of force is one of the most central components of law enforcement oversight. While taking appropriate investigative steps and critically assessing evidence are cornerstones of any investigation, they're especially vital in examining use of force. Given the dynamic and charged nature of use of force incidents, establishing a clear sequence of events and whether force was appropriate relies strongly on the quality, thoroughness, and completeness of the investigation, and the clarity and logical rigor of the analysis that follows. So to introduce our two panelists today, I'm very happy to introduce to you Jermaine Defoe. He has spent over 15 years conducting and supervising staff misconduct investigations and audits in multiple New York City oversight agencies. Mr. Defoe began his investigative career at the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, where he directed and conducted investigations into complaints involving excessive force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language by the public against NYPD officers. As an investigator and supervisor, he interviewed hundreds of police officers and civilian witnesses, analyzed medical evidence, police records, and other documentary evidence, and trained investigators on search and seizure and use of force investigation techniques. He later served as an investigator and supervisor for the New York City Department of Correction Investigation Division, which is the internal affairs unit and primary investigative body within the Department of Correction. There, he supervised multiple teams of field investigators, conducting investigations into alleged DOC staff misconduct and major incidents, including serious uses of force, sexual misconduct, and inmate deaths. This role involved dispatching investigators from a command unit on Rikers Island to jail facilities to gather all kinds of evidence in the field, and responding in person to major incidents to assume control of and to supervise crime scenes. reviewing case reports and charging instruments, and testifying in administrative and criminal proceedings, both at the local and federal level. Later, Mr. Defoe took over the training unit, the investigations division, where he designed the new investigator and in-service training programs there, training investigators and corrections captains on critical investigation and evidence evaluation techniques. Mr. Defoe is now the Executive Director of Risk Management and Audit at the New York City Department of Buildings, where he oversees fraud risk management, internal audit, and anti-corruption initiatives. He heads DOB's Risk Analysis and Compliance Unit, a team of analysts that performs in-depth subject matter research and statistical analysis to proactively identify internal control and compliance gaps. Our other panelists, also very happy to introduce to you Jennifer Jarrett, the Director of Training at the New York City CCRB. Ms. Jarrett has been with the agency for 15 years, so on this panel we have a little bit over, I believe, 30 years of combined experience. She began her tenure as an investigator, like Mr. Defoe, and spent several years supervising dozens of investigators. Mr. currently leads the new investigator training course and creates and leads continued and advanced trainings for the investigative staff. She has been a co-presenter of the Evaluating Use of Force lecture at the 2017 NACOLE annual conference. She's also presented the Investigating Search and Seizure webinar in 2018 and the How to Listen for, Recognize, and Break Down Assumptions and Conclusory Language lecture at the virtual 2020 NACOLE annual conference last year. She is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Jennifer.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yes, today we are going to be talking about use of force. This is something that I spend hours of time talking about with new investigators at the CCRB. So we won't be getting into everything today, but we really are going to be talking about best practices. And so the first thing that you need to know if you're going to be doing a use of force investigation is what your jurisdiction is. And certainly members of NACOLE, it's a huge range. Some people have oversight over procedural or administrative actions of the police. Some people have criminal oversight, criminal actions, civil actions. There's also local, state, or federal jurisdiction over law enforcement. So it's important to understand what your jurisdiction is before you can really even determine what it is that you are investigating. The FBI does have a National Use of Force Data Collection database, which is quite interesting. I won't get into everything they have, but they have, it explains how they collect their information and then how they present it as well. Sorry, something popped up on my screen. And then after determining your jurisdiction, you need to know what rules apply. So if you don't know what rules apply to the people you're overseeing, then, you're relying on gut feeling, which of course we don't do. And many of us in NACOLE don't set the rules ourselves. We follow rules that have already been set, either by the law enforcement entities that we oversee, by state and federal law. And so all of these things come into play. We're not sort of basing our rulings on gut feelings. We're basing them on existing rules and laws that apply. And so we need to know what those rules are before we even start our investigations, because a lot of our questions are going to be based on our understanding of the rules that apply, and asking, why questions based on the rules. And we are going to be talking about that later. And it also helps us understand how we're going to be analyzing the evidence that we actually gather. So let's talk about, before we get into the evidence, it's important to talk about procedural justice for a moment. The ideas of procedural justice are fairness, voice, transparency, and impartiality. And what this means is making sure that people appreciate that our investigations are fair to everyone, and that we're giving voice to everyone. Every person has a story to tell who's involved in any of the incidents, and so we need to make sure that we are facilitating people's ability to tell their story. And as much transparency as we are allowed to have, we should have. If people can't see how our investigations are occurring, it makes people think that, you know, there could be something going on that's not fair. And we really want to give the view of impartiality. Ultimately, you know, no one likes misconduct. So we can agree that misconduct is bad, but we can also agree that law enforcement following the rules is a good thing too. So we want to do impartial investigations. We want to make sure that we're being fair to everyone involved and that we're determining whether or not misconduct occurred. That's really what our focus is. And so to be able to do that, we really need to follow a systemic process that's established prior to the receipt of cases. We want to make sure that every single investigation follows the same rules. If we do something some ways and some things a different way, it's not going to be fair. And, you know, that's the first tenet that we really want to make sure that we are paying attention to. So in terms of the investigative process, you know, all good investigations follow the same core principles. Remaining neutral, you know, that important tenet of procedural justice, which also means recognizing and addressing feelings of bias. Everyone who comes into an investigation has their own perspective of what's going on. And even investigators, you know, we're not robots. So we have feelings when we're listening to stories being told. We have feelings when we're looking at videos. And so it's important to recognize how we're responding to things. You know, recognizing them so we can sort of move them to the side and, you know, really focus on the facts of what happened. Then we also need to be thorough. So we need to obtain all relevant statements, all video, all medical records. You know, this isn't something where we can just interview a few main people and get a general idea of what happened, or we get one video and then we don't have to look for the rest. So it's really important that we're thorough and we uncover every lead. Being thorough takes a lot of time, but we also have to work expeditiously. You know, if we aren't working quickly, people's memories of what happened fade very quickly. Videos get deleted. You know, your local corner store may have surveillance video, but they probably only keep it for a week or two. So if you don't get there quickly, the video is gone. So we really want to think about the importance of working quickly to get the things that can disappear, memories and videos. And then it's really important that we also wait until all evidence is collected to begin our analysis of whether or not misconduct occurred. We don't want to get caught up in, you know, every single piece of evidence we gather. We think, oh, this is it. Now I know the answer. We really want to wait until we've gathered everything and have a really thorough investigation, all of the evidence we need, and then we can start putting it together, you know, like puzzle pieces. And once we have all of the evidence, then we can start our analysis as to whether or not misconduct occurred. And so the evidence we'll be talking about today is statements, documentation, video, audio, and photographic evidence, and then physical evidence as well. So in terms of statements, you know, oral statements are some of the statements we collect. It's really important that we think about the statements people are giving to medical providers. Those are usually often the first statements that people are making to anyone about what happened to them in a use of force case. Also, if people are calling 911 or police officers are going over the radio, that certainly is, you know, the start of statements being made about what has happened in an incident. And so we certainly want to get the first statements people are making, civilians and officers alike. When we interview people, you know, that's an obvious statement that we're collecting from someone. And then when people go to court in a criminal trial, in a civil trial, there are also statements being made. And again, we want to be thorough. We don't want just one of those statements. If all of the statements exist, we want all of them so we can compare them and see, is the story changing? Is the story consistent? Is there certain information that we didn't know about in one statement that's not in any of the other statements? So if we're doing a thorough investigation, we want all of it because we know there can be interesting information in one piece of evidence that's not in another. And then written statements. People sometimes forget that if something's documented in some way, that it's, you know, coming from on high. Statements on paper are coming from people too. So we always need to think about that. Sometimes people write contemporaneous notes or, you know, just after an incident, they'll write down what happened to them. So that's great. We love something like that. If someone files a civil lawsuit, they have to make a statement about what happened to them, you know, that they're seeking recompense. If you're interviewing someone and they draw a map or a diagram, you know, this is what the inside of my apartment looks like. And here where I put the X is where they burst in the door, and here where I'm putting a circle is where they threw me onto my sofa. So those are really important statements for us too. We don't want to just think it's sort of like an extraneous piece of paper that we can get rid of. It's an important statement. Police documentation. It's so important that we think about what is actually a statement and who made that statement. Again, an arrest report is not dropping from the sky. An arrest report is being written by a police officer. Oftentimes a police officer who is at the scene, sometimes a police officer who's not even at the scene. So where would that officer even be getting the information to put in the arrest report? So we need to think about who wrote each police document statement and where the information was coming from, because later in the interview, when we're interviewing a police officer, we're going to want to show them this paperwork, and if there are any inconsistencies, address them on the record. But we need to know who they're coming from. And so we can't say, you know, if I'm a police officer and you're interviewing me, we can't say, oh, her statement is the same thing as the arrest report, so that must be exactly what happened. If the arrest report was written by my partner, then, you know, it makes sense that we would all say the same thing. So it, you know, we want to think about, okay, it's consistent and that's great, but we also want to think about these are all just statements and they all have equal weight to them. In terms of statements also, as I said before, we do have to get statements from all involved parties. So it doesn't mean there were 5 civilians there. So, you know, we got the gist of it from the first 2. Or there were 7 officers, but we got the gist of it from the main 2 officers who were involved. You know, we really do want to think about who has a story to tell about what happened. And each person could have a different story to tell from a different perspective. So it's really important that we get statements from everyone. It's also crucial that our interviews are conducted privately and separately, especially now with the pandemic. A lot of interviews are taking place over the phone or virtually, and you can't really have a private space as easily, or it's difficult to tell if someone is in a private space. If you hear someone else in the background saying things like, don't forget to say this, don't forget to say that, then we know immediately this is not a private space, and suddenly this is becoming a group interview. We definitely don't want to have that situation. You know, you want to say to the civilian, I need you to move to a different space where no one can hear what you're saying. I just want to hear your version of events. And then I'll talk to whoever is in the background and get their version of events. But it's really not helpful if we sort of have a group statement from everybody together. And it's important that we don't rule out witnesses because we think they might be biased. You know, my sister's going to be biased and say the same thing I do. That's not necessarily true. So you still, you know, should be interviewing my sister or someone who you just think probably didn't see anything. You never know until you ask, right? So you want to make sure that you're interviewing everyone. And then it's also really helpful to have an expansive view of who is a witness. If a security guard at a building calls police to the scene and says, you know, this is a security guard at a halfway house, and says one of the residents did something to another resident, even if the security guard didn't witness the actual interaction between the resident and the police officers, if the police officers come to the scene and speak to the security guard, then we want to speak to that security guard too. We want to know what the security guard told the police that the police were then taking action on. We don't want to just ask police officers, what did the security guard say to you? We will certainly ask them that, but we also want to speak to the security guard to see if they have the same version of events. You know, if the security guard said, this person has been violent, you know, we're very concerned, then how the officers respond to the person's room is going to be should be very different than if he said, oh, you know, the person was yelling at this other resident, but, you know, he certainly has never had a violent history and there's no reason to believe he's violent or has weapons or anything. You know, those are two very different scenarios. And so we want to know what's happening there. Or even if it's something like, you know, police officers burst in my door, they broke down the door, threw me on the sofa. Even if the super of the building was not present for the incident, if the super of the building can corroborate that the door was broken and that the super had to fix it, that's still an important piece of evidence for us. So we always want to think about who can give us a statement that can, you know, possibly corroborate some of what happened, or provide an alternate version of events that we didn't know about. When we interview people, we really want to think about, my job is to facilitate the person's ability to tell their story. So how do we do that? The best way to do that for any interview, of course, is asking open-ended questions. And we know what those are, the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. And the best way to begin an interview is to allow the person you're interviewing, civilians and officers, to give an open-ended narrative. You know, ask them in as much detail as you can, tell me what happened. And then they tell you, and then you take notes and you go back and you ask your questions based on what they've just said. It's always important to remember that our questions don't begin with the interaction. Our questions begin with some point before that. We're trying to figure out the beginning of the incident, and our questions don't end when the force ceases either. We want to know what happened afterwards, you know, with medical treatment obtained for someone, you know, with documentation filled out, with a supervisor brought to the scene, you know, what happened afterwards. And another important factor to think about is how trauma impacts memory. When people are experiencing trauma in a moment, oftentimes their memories are not being recorded. And this is not coming from me, you know, this is coming from psychologists who've been studying this for a long time. And so we ask a lot of detailed questions, and that's great, but we need to appreciate that sometimes people can't answer all of our questions because they didn't imprint memories of what was happening to them. And so we ask our questions, and we appreciate if people say, I don't remember, then, you know, that's a legitimate answer for them. Maybe they really don't remember what happened in that moment because they've never encoded memories in the first place. And of course, we know civilians can experience trauma as a result of force incidents, but members of law enforcement can as well. So it's important that we remember anyone can be experiencing trauma during these heightened incidents, particularly when serious uses of force are occurring. And so we also, when we're thinking about those open-ended questions, we need to think about what they're getting us. And so we need to think about what kinds of questions can get us action and what kinds of questions can get us justification. So when we're thinking about the allegations and trying to figure out what specifically happened, we ask our what questions. And then when we're trying to determine if things were okay, if the actions that actually occurred were okay, those are our why questions. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? And so it's important that both of these questions are being asked in our interviews. And so let's go through some examples of this. And as I had said before, we always want to start with the beginning of the incident, and the beginning of the incident is never the interaction. It's always something that happened before. So the second we start interviewing people, we want to think about what could possibly have happened at the beginning. So what was happening before the officers arrived? What did the officers know even before they began interacting with any civilians? Was there a call over the radio? Had they been to that location before? We need to know when each officer used force. This isn't sort of a group thing and a general thing. We really want to be very specific about who was doing what, when. And so we really want to think about what amount and type of force was used at each point, because some of the force might have been okay, some of it might not have been okay. So it's not a sort of zero-sum game where it's either all okay or all not. And so we really need to think about who was using the pepper spray and when was that pepper spray used, who was using the taser and when was that taser used. And then for each use of force, we always need to know what the civilian was doing at each point. If a civilian isn't compliant at the beginning and then a certain amount of force is used and then the civilian becomes compliant, then there likely isn't a reason for force to be used anymore. So we always have to think about, with each use of force, what was the civilian doing before the force was used, and then what was the civilian doing in response to the force that was being used. Every single time force is used. Each hit that might be happening, each blast of the taser is a different point in time. So we really need to focus on that. And you know, sort of in general, what was occurring when force was being used. How many officers were there? What was each of them doing? Was there a crowd there? What was the crowd doing? So we really want to know, not just in addition to the specifics of each actor at the scene, we also want to know just sort of a general overview of what everything else that was occurring. And again, we need to ask why force was necessary at each point. It's not just sort of, well, we were responding to this type of call, so everything that happens after that is either okay or not okay. We really want to ask after, you know, particularly in our officer interviews, why did you need to do this here? Why did you need to do this here? And then we also want to ask officers about why that particular type of force was suitable for that situation. Pepper spray is used in different situations from using a firearm, obviously. So we always want to think about, you know, why is this specific type of force being used at this point in time with this person? So those are really how our what and why questions are coming up. And then, of course, if people are injured, we want to ask how those injuries occurred, obviously from civilians and officers alike. We want an explanation for how those injuries occurred and when. And then, of course, you know, any questions we have about medical treatment are going to be really important too. And so, yes, as I said, the beginning is always prior to the interaction, and with the why each use of force was, you know, that particular use of force is important, because the justification for taking someone to the ground is different from why pepper spray was then used, even if within moments of each other. And questions should follow the chronology of the incident as much as possible. If you are being interviewed and someone is jumping back and forth in time, it's really confusing about what is happening. It's much easier for everyone, for the interviewer and the interviewee, if you're just very methodical about moving forward in time in small increments, get all of the information about what's happening in a tiny moment, and then move on from there, and then move on from there. But you know, it's not a good situation if you are in the middle of someone being tasered and then you realize you never even asked what had gone over the radio earlier, what they knew when they got there, if they had ever interacted with that person before. So we do want to make sure that we're moving forward incrementally in time. And obviously we have to ask about all issues under investigation. We don't want to just question people in a vacuum where we're only asking about what was happening during the use of force. We really need to broaden it, because we never know what will be coming into play. You know, what were the civilians doing throughout the course of the incident? Maybe things are escalating. We need to know what the officers are doing, how the officers are interpreting what they're seeing and hearing and experiencing. And We need to clarify any area of the account that is unclear. Again, I mean, this is something that's so crucial for any interview that we do, but ultimately in your head, you should not fill in anything that people haven't said. The person in front of you should be filling in everything. So don't say, I think I get what you're saying. If you can't reenact it yourself, ask more questions to make sure that you know how far apart people were standing when the officers first started speaking to the person. Don't think that it doesn't matter and that all you need to focus on is when the punch happened. So we really want to make sure that we can picture anything. Avoid interrupting people. Sometimes when you ask a question, you don't get the answer to the question that you thought you were asking. So allow people to finish their answer, and then you'll want to go back to your original question and rephrase it in a way that hopefully will get at the information that you wanted originally. But we don't want to interrupt people. And of course, we don't want to ask leading questions that only allow for a yes or no answer, because then who's doing most of the talking? The person conducting the interview. And who's doing very little talking? The person who only has the option of saying yes or no. So we don't want to ask leading questions, and we don't want to ask compound questions. Compound questions is when you're asking multiple questions at once. So when you started taking him to the ground, you had said before that he was resisting, right? And so then because he was resisting, were you intending to take him to the ground because you fear for your safety, or did something, you know? And so you can go on and on and on and start asking multiple questions at once, and it becomes impossible for anyone to answer. They will answer part of your question, but not all of it. So it's easy to start saying a question like that. Stop yourself. That's all you have to do. And say, you know what, I want to rephrase that. I just want to focus on this, and then I'll ask you some more questions in a few seconds. So when you find yourself asking leading questions, if you hear the person saying yes or no a couple times, you know, just reorient yourself and say, you know what, I want to re-ask something. And it's important to keep in mind, we're never interrogating anyone. So we're not trying to, you know, break people and get to the sort of like, you can't handle the truth moment. You know, we're really giving people an opportunity to tell their story. We are going to address inconsistencies among any statements that they have, among things that they've told us, among evidence that we've collected. And then we will have people explain it. And, you know, if people have a poor explanation, then that will be in our analysis. But ultimately, you know, we're not going to keep asking people the same things over and over again, waiting for them to say, you're right, I lied. You're not going to be getting information that way. So we really don't interrogate people. And, you know, I said before, you really need to be able to picture exactly what's happening. You really need to be able to, in your head, reenact exactly what was happening. You know, if I asked you, what does rough up mean? I mean, we know what it means. You know, these are real words. It's not that they have no real meaning, but they are characterizations of behavior. They're conclusory terms. They're not very specific. And so we want to get at the specifics. If you can't act out exactly what a specific officer did to a specific civilian, or allegedly did, you know, according to the story of the interview, then you just need to ask more detailed questions. You know, someone being threatening, I don't know what that means. Someone resisting, I don't know specifically what that means they were doing. You know, an officer threw me to the ground. I want to know, where on your body were you touched? What was the officer using to touch you? You know, like when you landed on the ground, what part of your body landed, you know, and, you know, what side were you facing, up or down, things like that. We really want to know specifics. And so if you are just sort of letting the information wash over you and these words wash over you, you're not going to have enough details. And that's really what we want. We really want to know specific details. So these are the kinds of words that you want to look out for. I feared for my safety is something that police officers tell us. And that in and of itself doesn't mean that it's not true. But that in and of itself is not enough to justify the use of force. We need to know what specific factors were occurring that made the officer fear for his or her safety. And so that's really what we want to get at. We don't want these sort of cursory characterizations of what was going on. I was afraid is not in and of itself reason for anyone to have any sort of particular behavior. We want to know, well, why were you fearful? Why did you take the actions that you took? And in terms of inconsistencies, you know, I said before, we're not interrogating people, but it doesn't mean that we gloss over inconsistencies. We need to be really careful to note all of the inconsistencies that are happening and address them. But I like to use the word clarify because we are trying to clarify. We're not trying to trap people. Lots of times when we're clarifying things, we discover that we just had a misunderstanding, particularly because when we interview people, they give us a brief narrative and then we start asking more detailed questions. And so sometimes it can sound like the story has started to change. You know, then we start getting into detailed questions. Yeah, so then it was the officer with the black hair who was the first one to use force against me. And then you may say, well, you know, originally you had said it was the officer with the red hair. Well, that was the officer who pushed me onto the sofa, but it was the officer with the black hair who started punching me. So it was just sort of, you know, a summary. So we, you know, when we ask detailed questions, things may seem to change. So we want to clarify to make sure we're understanding everything properly. And so it's important that while we're in the middle of an interview, we're careful with our notes and we're reviewing them to see if anything has changed so we can address those inconsistencies. And it's important before an interview begins that we know what was in those prior written statements. And again, prior written statements aren't just someone writing in their journal. It is things like arrest reports and memo books and any sort of forced documentation that officers have to fill out. So we really want to make sure that we are presenting that paperwork in those prior written statements to the people who wrote them, as well as other officers who were at the scene. If my partner and I are both there and we're both seeing the same things, it doesn't matter if my partner wrote the summary. I should have a consistent statement with what my partner wrote as the summary because we were both there. So we both should be able to account for what happened in a similar way. So we always want to make sure that we're thinking about what is a statement and what statements do we have before the interview even begins. And of course, if there are photographs of injuries, either that law enforcement took or that the civilians took themselves and medical records, we always want to go over those as well with civilians to find out, you know, how they account for the injuries, and officers as well, of course, we want to know that. We like to present video footage at the end of an interview. And it's not a sort of a gotcha thing. It really is when you're watching video, you can end up adopting certain moments into your memory without even really realizing it. You know, our brain is always trying to make sense of things that happen to us. And so our brain will try to fill in the blanks of things that we couldn't have possibly seen. And sometimes if an officer's watching, you know, their own body-worn camera, there might be something that they didn't even notice, and now they're seeing it in the video, and it sort of becomes part of their own memory, or watching, you know, something from their partner's BWC. So that's really why we like to save the video for the end, because we want to hear their story as they have to tell it. But obviously, when we're showing video, we want to address any inconsistencies there. You know, sometimes when we address inconsistencies, the story starts changing, and then changing again, and then changing again. You know, we give people the opportunity to change their story, ask them why did you change your story? You know, we do have to ask this hard question. Why did you say before that, if now you're saying this after viewing the video? And then if they change it again, we want to ask, well, so why are you now changing it a third time? But that's it. That's their choice to sort of have this on the record. Again, we're not trying to break people. So we're not going to get to a point where we're saying your story keeps changing because you're lying, right? Just admit it, just admit it. You know, we're really not trying to break anyone. If people are giving us a version of events that keeps changing and they're unable to sort of tell us a consistent version of events, then that will be part of our analysis. All right, so video evidence. You know, we are collecting so much video evidence now. It is a really important part of our investigation. But it's important to remember video doesn't speak for itself. It's not the whole investigation. You know, we would all be out of jobs if video alone sort of did the investigation for us. So it's important that we analyze video carefully too. And, you know, keep in mind, it often doesn't even show the entirety of an incident. So in this slide, you see on the right 3 different types of video. So the first one is an example of body-worn camera that police officers are wearing. Oftentimes, the cameras are on their chest or maybe on their shoulder. So you only have a certain view of the incident. You can see this person's face is cut off, probably taller than the officer. So, you know, there's a limit to the view, and certainly in force investigations, if there's a physical confrontation, then, you know, basically the camera is capturing clothing. So suddenly you're missing all of the action that's happening. So body-worn camera is not the be-all and end-all of determining whether or not misconduct occurred. The second photo is cell phone video. That can be helpful too, but again, just like with body-worn camera, cell phone video and body-worn camera is turned on at a certain point. With body-worn camera, there are some jurisdictions where the camera goes on automatically, but there are also other jurisdictions where officers have to turn it on, and they're deciding when to turn it on, just like someone is deciding when to turn on the cell phone video. So we don't know what was happening prior to that. And that's really important for us to know. Oftentimes with cell phone video, it's moving a lot too. So there's a lot that you can't see. As cameras move, things are blurry, you know, it's hard to orient yourself. And then the third photo is surveillance video. And surveillance video can be great. It can give us, you know, sort of a larger angle of what happened. No one's turning it on or turning it off. So we can capture the entire incident if everything happens within view of the camera. But particularly with force incidents, you know, people are moving a lot. So something can be happening and then suddenly grappling starts to occur, and then boom, everyone's off the camera and you can't see what's happening anymore. So that's why we want to get all video possible. We don't want just one of these videos. Usually it's piecing things together carefully to figure out what happened. So when we're obtaining our video, it's important that we think about certain things. Who's behind the camera? Who controls when it's on, where it's pointed, when it turns off? And we want to know what's captured inside the bounds of the frame. What's outside the frame? What can't we see that might be occurring? Is there a crowd there? Is there no crowd there? So we really want to think about that, and you know, what portion is being captured and what is missing. We always want to think carefully about what might be missing, and you know, how viewable is the video? Is it fluid? Is it choppy? And then we also want to think about how many frames are being freshly recorded. And so with digital video, it's basically a grid of little tiny squares. And the reason that video cameras can be so small that they can fit on someone's chest or in someone's cell phone without the battery conking out in about 3 seconds is because not all of those little pixels are being refreshed every millisecond. Sometimes it takes as long as 3 or 4 seconds, and sometimes the digital video is actually reading for movement. And so if it doesn't sense movement, it will just show the same pixels for, you know, maybe as much as 3 seconds. And so then if something that had been moving suddenly starts moving, then it might not capture it instantly, and even a delay of a couple of milliseconds can make things appear different. If I'm taking a step and it doesn't capture me beginning to take the step, it might look like I'm lunging forward because it's having me standing still and then suddenly I'm forward. So we really want to think carefully about that as well, which is why we want to be so careful and not let video do our entire investigation for us, and why we want to get as much video as we can. And then finally, we also want to think about, you know, who's the source of the video and could it have been edited or digitally manipulated in some way. Medical records, obviously, so crucial for us to obtain. They can be important evidence in analyzing physical force, but they cannot prove misconduct. Excessive force does not always result in an injury. And so that's important to keep in mind. And an injury does not mean excessive force was used. So when we're getting medical records, we use them as a tool to help us figure out what happened. And then the why questions often are not answered with medical records. So medical records can confirm or disprove alleged injuries. It can note a civilian's condition at the scene. We can get statements from officers and civilians alike. We can find out if someone was intoxicated, if there was a psychological assessment done and what their history is, depending on what the behavior was at the scene. We can find out the mode of transportation from the scene. It might help us identify officers. We can determine if there are pre-existing conditions, like maybe the person had broken their arm a week earlier in a car accident. It can help us identify officers, and it can help us identify EMTs too. They're great witnesses for us because they're often the first people on the scene responding. When we get medical records, three things we want to focus on: statements made by civilians or officers to medical personnel, the diagnosis, this person has a 3-inch laceration, and the treatment. This person required stitches for the laceration. That's what we want to focus on. Someone having an appendectomy when they were 12 years old, we don't need to worry about. So really focus on the statements, the diagnosis, and the treatment. And the different types of medical records that we get are paperwork filled out by EMTs. Those are great statements because, again, they are often the first people on the scene, even before someone gets to the hospital, and they fill out their own paperwork. We also want to get certified medical records from the hospital. We want to make sure that it's records from the hospital so they haven't been edited in any way. And if you can get a relationship with the medical examiner's office in your jurisdiction, that's great. Obviously, if there's a death in custody case, we want their records about how the person died. But also, sometimes they can consult in our cases. If everyone's in agreement about what the injuries are, but not about how they were obtained, we can also, if we have a relationship with a medical examiner, we can send them the medical records and send them a summary of what happened and ask them, is this injury more consistent with running and falling, or is this injury more consistent with being slammed into the wall of a holding cell? So it's important for you to sort of make these connections. You will likely need HIPAA forms signed by people before you can get any sort of medical record, and likely a subpoena, but obviously you'll need to think about your jurisdiction, reach out to all of these different people and find out what they need from you. All right. So now we've talked about all the evidence that we want to get in a force investigation. So now let's think about what we're going to do with all of the evidence that we've collected at the end. The goal of the analysis is, first, what force, if any, did the officer use? The what question. We have to figure out what happened. And then, was that force permissible under existing guidelines? That's why those rules are so important for us. So first, in terms of what happened, we have to establish the facts of the incident. This is where we're going to be sorting through everything that we gathered. We didn't have to figure out whether misconduct occurred when we first got the case. This is why we've been gathering evidence for so long. So we're going to compare everything, lay all of our cards on the table and figure out how it stacks up. And then we're going to resolve any discrepancies that exist between officer statements and civilian statements. Even internally, partners may have differing versions of events. And then we want to look through and see what we can find that's consistent. What statements are consistent. This officer is consistent with the paperwork he wrote about the incident. Okay. But, written statements that this officer made doesn't corroborate what he said. It's just consistent. So corroborate is when we have an independent piece of evidence that bolsters a statement and makes it stronger. So then we're going to look for anything that we can corroborate. Do we have an independent piece of evidence? Does all of the video consistently show that something happened? Great. And then what can we credit as a result of that? And so that's really what we want to think about. And so first we need to do all of that to figure out the what. If the what is still in question, we can't get to the rules yet. So we need to figure out the what first and then we can start thinking about the rules that apply. And this is where those established guidelines come into play. They really focus our analysis so quickly. The officer's actions must be analyzed in the context of the established guidelines. And so at that point, we want to look through any legal guidelines that are important, and certainly the Supreme Court has cases, constitutional limitations on police force, decided in Tennessee v. Garner, Graham v. Connor, and then lower court decisions as well in your own state and in your own jurisdiction will be making decisions about what officers can use. And then in use of force cases, a lot of the time, we're really looking at police manuals and tactical training about what they're saying that officers can use. And they're telling their officers what they can and cannot do. And so we're holding officers to the standards. And so here is an example of sort of objective criteria to consider. This comes from the NYPD Patrol Guide, which is public, it's on the internet. And it helps to think about these things when we're trying to think about, whether or not misconduct occurred. So we want to think about the totality of the circumstances. So it's never just sort of like, you need 5 of these, or 3 of these, or all of these. We just want to think about what's happening. So what is the officer's tenure and experience? What is the nature and severity of the crime? Officers responding to a call for people being loud and drinking alcohol on the street is very different from officers responding to a call of someone stabbing someone. We want to know what the actions were that were taken by the civilian at each point and the duration of the action. Again, if someone is compliant, then things should be ending. If someone is non-compliant for a long period of time, then that is a different story. The immediacy of the perceived threat or harm to any civilians, officers, or bystanders, and then whether the civilian is actively resisting custody. And so we want to understand what resisting even means. Again, that's pretty vague. So think about whether your jurisdiction has defined what resisting even is. Passive resistance and active resistance are 2 very different things. So what officers should be doing in response to each of those is very different. Whether the civilian is attempting to evade arrest by flight, the number of civilians in comparison to the number of officers, the size, age, and condition of the civilian in comparison to the officers, the civilian's violent history, if known. Maybe officers have already encountered this person before and have experienced, violence from this person in response. So that's important to know. The presence of a crowd and the crowd's behavior. Crowds are allowed to form. They're allowed to say, this isn't right. That's very different from a crowd where they're throwing things at the officer, encouraging the person to, have a physical response to what officers are doing, things like that. So we want to think about the behavior of the crowd, most importantly. And then we want to think about, is the civilian apparently under the influence of a stimulant or narcotic, which would affect pain tolerance? If officers are trying to use force and the person seems impervious to it, that will change how they are responding. And then finally, we really want to think carefully, was there ever an opportunity for officers to de-escalate? If they had de-escalated the situation at the beginning, could all of this force have been avoided? So we want to ask officers about that in our interviews. When did it occur? Was it utilized? And what was the result? So officers should be thinking about de-escalation, and we want to ask them about it, and then we want to think about it in our final analysis. And then the conclusion of the analysis at this point is really, we compare the established facts to the established guidelines. We make an unbiased determination that best fits the established facts and guidelines. And then the established facts and guidelines should be presented in a way that is readily understandable to all audiences. We don't have to use fancy language. We don't have to use police jargon. We don't have to use legal jargon. We want to use simple, straightforward words that don't have sort of a biased meaning to them. And so any reader can understand how we came to the conclusion that we came to. And having this systematic investigative process really allows for consistency for all investigations, regardless of who is conducting them. So we're getting back to procedural justice, the idea of fairness and impartiality. And then finally, our conclusion can be as simple as something like this. As noted above, the investigation used the collected evidence to determine that X happened. X factors existed, and P.O. Smith stated that she used this type of force as a result because of those factors, which is why she felt this type of force was the most appropriate use of force at that time. The rule, the police patrol guide, whatever it is, states this type of force can be used under these circumstances. As a result, the investigation determined that this use of force was appropriate or misconduct. I mean, it really is sort of that straightforward under these circumstances, and it is recommended that. And that's really, so by the time we're getting to the point of the analysis, it really is quite straightforward. And so that is my part of the presentation. And now Jermaine can take over.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. So I'm here to talk about use of force investigation also, just from a corrections context. So what I'm not going to do is rehash what Jen said, because she basically went over the details of how to conduct a use of force investigation and things to consider. I'm just going to talk about things that are relevant specifically to corrections, as that might be helpful for your investigations. So just real quick, we're going to talk about how correction use of force investigations are similar and how they differ slightly, and special considerations of best practices for conducting corrections in a investigation in a corrections context, and how to operationalize these considerations for your investigations. So that's the basic gist of it. So first, just out of the gate, kind of like Jen said, I want to talk about some important caveats. There's going to be differences, obviously. So I worked in the New York City Department of Correction Investigation Division, which is overseeing a very large jail population compared to a lot of other jurisdictions. So size is obviously a consideration. So it might have a totally different size. The terminology used, everybody knows that it's alphabet soup in every law enforcement agency, definitely including corrections, and terminology is going to be different. So keep that in mind. The detention status of people who are incarcerated. So basically in Rikers Island in New York City, basically you have detainees awaiting trial and you have people sentenced up to 1 year. You may be talking about different situations which you have only detainees or only sentenced, could be completely different rules. And then speaking of rules and regulations governing staffing and inmate conduct. There are many, and they're going to be different, varied based on jurisdiction. And other smaller things like how, when, and the extent to which services and programs are administered. Very different among different jurisdictions. Some are similar, but some are different. And importantly, the mandate and powers of investigators and oversight bodies. So I was internal to the Department of Correction, which means we had unlimited access to all records, which is a factor. However, knowing what the records are, even if you don't have immediate access to them, is relevant. That's obviously going to be a jurisdictional difference, right? So I just wanted to get those caveats out of the way from the beginning. So the difference. So correction force investigations, like I said, are largely similar, actually, to police use of force investigations in terms of the steps taken and the analysis of evidence. Basically, everything that Jen said really does apply very much to corrections investigations because they're actually pretty similar in terms of the rules, procedures, evidence gathering. However, what is different is the context in which any of this is done. So the context in which force is employed, the context in which evidence is collected and investigation conducted are pretty starkly different. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on a little bit today. So these are the key considerations. I kind of bulleted them out here because they can help you kind of understand the context here. So number one, and probably arguably most important, is to understand the environment. So we're going to go into a little bit what that means, but the environment in corrections is obviously very different than encounters on the street or even encounters in people's homes. So understanding the physical environment and the procedural environment, incredibly important. I can't overstate that. Then there's establishing the lead up to the incident. Jen touched on this earlier, but the lead up in a correction environment can sometimes be considerably longer and more involved than an encounter on the street or in a police context for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about. Broaden the scope of evidence, meaning what you're looking at may be a little bit different, a little bit broader than in a police context, simply because of the environment where you're working and what the actual rules and regulations are. And then broaden the scope of the analysis, how to make sure that your analysis is sound and basically compare the different theories of the case in a way that actually makes sense and strengthens your analysis a little bit. So those are the main points that we're going to cover here. So number one is understand the environment. So understanding the environment in corrections, like I said, is probably the most important thing if I had to guess. So basically, if you understand the environment, you understand a lot of things. So the basic principle there is deeply understanding the environment and the rules and procedures that govern inmates and staff, and the facilities where they live and work, which could be a single facility, could be multiple. That's critical. Basically, if you don't know what is supposed to happen in this place, then you will not know what happened incorrectly in this place. So if you don't understand the place, you don't understand the incident. That is number one for corrections investigations, in my opinion. So these two types of environments we're looking at in this instance, we're talking about the physical/control environment, I'm calling it, and the procedural environment. Those are two different but interrelated things. And we'll talk a little bit about what those might mean. So as far as physical control environment, there's in a corrections environment, which is different than on the street, obviously. It's a closed environment. Inmate movements are by definition restricted. Single cell, building, room, they can't move. If you're a civilian walking around in life, you pretty much have unrestricted access to everywhere, with the exception maybe being in the subway. There's subway rules, in the library there's library rules, but in inmate environment, there's rules for everywhere you are, and that confines your movement. This is important in general, but specifically for corrections investigations. Then there's rules of behavior for inmates are tightly prescribed and highly specific, often dependent on physical housing location. For example, if I'm an inmate in a facility, if I'm a high-class inmate in a facility, I'm in punitive segregation, the rules that apply to me are very different than the rules that apply to inmate B, who is in a dorm setting 4 houses away with a much lower classification. So knowing what the housing area is, the classification of the inmate, which would basically be the level of essentially danger that the facility has determined through a variety of factors that this inmate has, and the level of classification, which can be based on a number of things, including the charge, their disciplinary history inside, and various other things. Knowing the rules that apply to inmates, even the random ones, like, for example, you can't wear a hat, you can't put your hands in your pocket, the different footwear you can wear, has definitely a major impact on the investigation and knowing what's supposed to be happening. And then lastly, officers supervise and direct every aspect of the inmate life, focus on maintaining physical custody and control. So in New York City Corrections, care, custody, and control is basically what you're doing as a correction officer. So this means you have a lot of contact with that inmate in their entire life, not necessarily just this force incident, not this incident, meaning every aspect of the inmate's life is intertwined with the officer's life, meaning you need toilet paper and officers giving you toilet paper, like at that level. So the number of interactions between officers and civilians, officers and inmates is much higher. So the number of opportunities for force and the number of nuances in those interactions is also much higher, which means you just need to understand them more and give them more than understand the context way more. So we talked about the physical control, basically, this physical and control environment. That's not the whole thing, obviously. There's like the building and the in places where they are, and there's also the procedures and the rules that govern this space and govern the people in the space, both officers and inmates. And you may call them like, guards or prisoners, depending on your jurisdiction, but the concept is the same. In a correction context, understanding the rules and procedures is important, but not just use of force procedures. I mean the procedures of everything. And they go far beyond use of force guidelines 99% of the time. And this is rules of, for example, inmate movement, custody, and restraint. Is this a person supposed to be handcuffed when they're escorted? Or are they just walking free? Are they supposed to wear a jumpsuit? They're supposed to wear their regular clothes. Are they searched before they leave the housing area or not? These are all factors you know from the environment, the classification of the inmate, and the location that they're in. Completely separate from force guidelines. How, when, and where, and to whom the services are provided. So meaning, for example, if I'm an inmate in punitive segregation, which means I'm in isolation essentially for 23 hours a day, with the exception of recreation and services, that means I may receive services differently. If I go to recreation, I'm going to a different place than everybody else and much different security environment. Which staff members are required to be present, when, for how long, during various administrative procedures like searches. So basically, if you have a search, let's say a tactical search operation of the entire facility, you need to know where everybody is. There are rules about that. Rules about a search on the count, which is basically every time they change tours, there's another search that's happening. Where are people supposed to be? You have to know these things also. How and where movement, activities, and all of their occurrences in the facility are documented. Because basically, one of the strong benefits of doing an investigation in a corrections environment is documentation is everywhere. Everything is documented everywhere, and logbooks coming out the woodwork. So knowing where it's supposed to be documented and where it's supposed to be documented gives incredible context and helps you understand what's going on in the environment, but also who is present and various other things. Knowing these things in the procedural environment is critical well before you get to the force. And this is a very important point also. So there's just some environment questions you can potentially ask yourself if you're doing an investigation in correction context. And this includes just basically small holding cell facilities. There are rules and regulations that govern those as well. So what are the custody and restraint regulations, which you kind of talked about? Front cuffed, rear cuffed, waist chain. Are they supposed to be in isolation? Are they supposed to have a one-on-one with an officer? So what are the custody and restraint regulations? What are the procedures, regulations governing this type of housing area in general? Like in this type of housing area, when do they get visits? How often do they get visits? How often are they escorted? Do they need an escort with them? Where and how do they get medication? These sorts of things are all known based solely on the type of housing area it is. What services and programs are provided? When they go to recreation, when they go ministerial services, all of these things, how, when, who takes them? Do they do it in-house? Do they do it out of house? How many staff members are supposed to be assigned to this area? Usually, let's say in corrections, you have a housing area, you have an officer who controls the doors more or less electronically from a control station with a bubble, let's say, and then you have an officer that's on the floor who's watching the actual either cell or dorm setting. However, in a different setting, you may have way more officers than that. You may have officers that are assigned to escort. You may have officers that are assigned to the day rooms to make sure where people are actually congregating and hanging out. You have an extra officer assigned. Knowing how many people are supposed to be there is pretty critical. How often are supervisors required to be in the area? There's requirements on when supervisors are supposed to be, basically do a tour or basically a patrol of the area and see if the officers are actually doing their job. Is it multiple times per hour? Is it many, many more times than that? Hard to tell unless you look into it. When and how often are tasked with physically moving people? How often is this officer supposed to physically interact with this inmate as part of their job versus what they're doing on video right now? If you know that part of their job is taking inmates for medication, part of their job is making sure that inmates are searched, then you know that this is normal or abnormal. These are environment questions you need to ask, because otherwise nothing will make sense to you. So this is kind of examples of what can environment tell us. There's many things environment can tell us, as we just saw, but here's an example. So an inmate was involved in the use of force with an officer at 2100 hours while preparing to leave the housing area. Housing area, by the way, if I'm using jargon, which shouldn't, hopefully not that complicated, it's where inmates are housed. So basically a housing area includes, cells and beds, cells or beds, depending on the situation, but then also usually a common area, a pantry where food is served. This is a corrections in New York City. Obviously it varies, but preparing to leave the housing area means leaving this place. He will not live here anymore, possibly. With no other information about the incident, what can we know about from the environment alone? Like no other information. That's just the summary we've gotten. And the answer is, of course, a ton, a lot of information you can know. Whether the departure at the housing area at 9 p.m., is that normal? I don't know. What time did they lock in? Do you know that? If you don't know that, then you better figure it out. What items the inmate would normally be wearing or carrying? Normally. Let's say, is he in a jumper or is he in his street clothes? Is that normal, abnormal for this area? Would he be carrying his clothing? Would he be carrying one of those mini Walkmans that some inmates are allowed to have and some are not? How many inmates, if any, would be present in the area? We talked briefly about dorm and cell setting. Right? If it's a dorm, which I'm saying basically just beds, looks literally like a dorm with beds everywhere, the number of inmates who could see that incident could be significantly higher than a cell setting where basically maybe the inmates who literally have their little window that they can see through, maybe they can see. Dorm or cell makes a big difference. How many staff members would be present given what's happening? How many staff members are assigned to the housing area in general? What equipment they would be carrying? This is all dependent on the environment. Whether a handheld video camera would be required. In some instances it is, in some housing areas, and some it is not. Is a first line supervisor or second line supervisor required to be there, supposed to be there, should be there, and is it normal? Is the inmate being searched before they leave reasonable or not? Searches being, of course, in a very different context than on the street and in the street encounter with a police officer, in which there are many, many, many reasons an inmate can be searched, including random. But being searched before leaving a housing area might be a security issue for specific types of houses like punitive segregation. Where would an inmate normally be taken following the use of force? Decontamination room, intake, another search, isolation cell. This all depends on the environment. You could know that literally from that summary alone. If you knew about the housing area, you'd know how many of these things are normal. That's how important this is. So the second principle we talked about was establishing a lead up. Jen talked about it a little bit. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more because it's that important. Knowing what happened before the incident, the force incident is part of it. The lead up to the force incident can be significantly more and a significantly bigger deal. In a corrections context, because everyone lives together, more or less, the lead up can be way longer and you can have information from way farther back that's actually relevant. So we're going to talk a little bit about the principles surrounding that. So one key principle, like I was saying just now, what leads up to the use of force is sometimes very important, usually, to understanding the sequence of events, establishing credibility, and whether force is justified. Sometimes even more so than the force incident itself. Like knowing the lead up can basically give the whole game. So interaction between inmates and staff that occurred minutes, hours, days, even weeks before an incident can be important. And you may or may not have access to that information, which is a little different on the street, which is a little bit harder to get that. So defining the lead up and collecting evidence about the lead up is very critical to pretty much any investigation. And in corrections, you could argue more so. So defining the lead up has a lot of different information that you could gather, but obviously some of it's more obvious than others. So verbal disputes and physical altercations with other inmates or staff in the hours or days preceding the incident is going to be pretty important, obviously. But even things that are not necessarily directly tied to the use of force. Housing movements and cell or bed changes for participants and witnesses. So for example, if the incident happened in housing area 1 upper, but he moved from 2 lower 20 minutes before the incident, you may have information relevant about why he moved from 2 lower to 1 upper. This is information that you might want to get. Significant events that are affecting the physical conditions of the housing area. The examples like if you're flooding, power outage, cell malfunction, searches, inmate disturbances, which is the colloquial term essentially for a riot. So in that sort of, I mean the technical term, I guess. So basically the issue there is if the physical condition of the housing area can affect the use of force, it could basically precipitate it. So if there is flooding, let's say in a housing area, that can cause friction between inmates and staff that escalates later into force. Debates about what cell should be vacated and cleaned and which one shouldn't, what the order they should go in. These are relevant issues that happen basically purely on the physical condition of the housing area, and that lead up is important. You also have disciplinary infractions incurred and resulting administrative proceedings. So like I said, there are many rules governing inmates and staff in general. So if infractions of these rules happen, knowing exactly what happened and what was said about those things well before this incident can definitely give you some valuable insight. So defining the lead up a little bit more broadly than 10 minutes before the guy was having an argument, it can definitely help, because if you know those things leading up to it, you can get a lot more information about what happened afterward. So these are key considerations for the lead up and kind of how you can get more information about the lead up. Usually in a correction environment, you're talking to inmates, obviously, and sometimes it's a little harder to tease this information out because for a variety of reasons. So you can ask individuals, like Jen said, not only the what, but the why. So, okay, so there was use of force that happened after the inmate locked in, or as he's about to lock in, ask why an inmate took certain actions, for example, which is true of staff also, but very important for inmates because they may not provide that information voluntarily, and you may have to ask more questions to elicit detail. So we know this happened when an inmate refused to lock in, this use of force, let's say. Why did you say he wouldn't lock in? Well, because after I cursed at him, he told me that at lock-in, he was coming for me. So I thought he was going to come in my cell and beat me up. If you don't ask why, he's just going to say, I refused to lock in, and then this happened, which is pretty much consistent with the officer's statement. Let's say he refused to lock in, but why? Oh, because before he said he was going to beat me up. That's why I didn't want to go in there. Now, like I said, there's some idiosyncrasies about jail in specific that, for example, time can get very, very distorted. Days become very, very similar, so that knowing it was on a Wednesday or a Thursday becomes very difficult. Knowing that it was at 12 versus 1 becomes very difficult. Someone once said to me, it's like Vegas, but much less fun. Basically, if you establish proximity to documented services or events, you can get a better sense of time pacing and what actually happened and when it happened. So instead of, let's say, I don't know what happened, it happened last week, that's not that helpful. But if he said, the officer said it to me, he basically told me he was going to beat me up at lock-in yesterday, right as we were going out for our visits. Okay. And that was after the top tier flooded and sanitation came. Okay. I don't know what time that was, but I definitely know what days you go out for visits because that's on a schedule. And I know that the top tier flooded at X, Y, and Z time. I might know this information, even though I don't know the time. And then, of course, you basically review documentation and other evidence to focus your evidence collection. At 12 o'clock, the top tier flooded, 12:15 sanitation came, 1300, these inmates were out for visits. So obviously in this scenario, you'd want to talk to these inmates. That is important. I'm sorry, real quick here. So knowing the actual sequence of events, usually in a logbook we're talking about here, 12, 12:15, 1300, those are actually times that somebody has to put in a book of what happened at that time. So now you basically have the people you want to talk to and the time that they interacted. So that conversation about cursing at me and threatening me, which may or may not be relevant to this investigation, but it's definitely important background, you now have way more information about it than you did previously. So I had mentioned broaden the scope of evidence as kind of the third concept there. So more or less what you want to be able to do is think about evidence a little creatively and don't limit it to just what happened at that time, not only going backwards, but just the types of things and the amount that you want to collect. So that's, of course, important in any investigation, but definitely in corrections environment, largely because there's a lot of information out there, not only about what happened in this particular instance, but what's happening in this building in general. So accessing and getting that information in a correction context requires you to do a bunch of things. One of these being think creatively and broadly, another being over collect rather than under collect, and preempt the evidence collection challenges that you pretty much know will exist based on where you are. Basically, if you're in jail, there's going to be evidence collection challenges pretty much guaranteed in every investigation. So knowing that ahead of time and how to preempt them and overcome them is important. So there are a number of different types of evidence, and Jen went over some of them, and some of them are very similar and related, but slightly different. So inmate interview statements, like we talked about, you're obviously going to talk to the inmate, the involved inmate. If you don't, then you got a problem. The involved inmate witnesses, obviously inmates who can see this incident or hear this incident ideally, and inmate workers. So in a lot of correction contexts, you'll have workers who are inmates, but they're paid a small amount to do certain jobs, for like suicide prevention aid or a pantry worker who don't actually live in this housing area but come in and work there. They may work there, they may live there, but sometimes they don't. They have their cell there or in another place. So they're basically of the housing area, but not necessarily of the housing area. So inmate workers can be helpful. Civilian staff interviews, obviously. And obviously you want to have, this is in addition to officer statements, obviously. Civilian staff interviews, medical staff, teachers, cooks, other civilian witness interviews like visitors. So the standard stuff is like the involved inmate and staff, but you also have these other options, right? So if there's a civilian witness that could happen in the visit house, for example. And then there's documentary and electronic evidence. So some of this is, like we talked about a little bit before, logbooks, obviously video surveillance. The benefit of video surveillance, like Jen talked about a little bit before, is some of these, depending on the facility, depending on the jurisdiction and the rules involved, some can have extensive overhead video surveillance, meaning every housing area that is covered, every stairwell, or whatever. Some can be much less. Some can be on DVRs. Some can be in various forms, but having video is obviously critical. So they're stationary, handheld, and body cam. And these definitely get employed in different situations at different times, which again goes back to understanding the rules. Inmate phone call recordings. So there are situations in which inmates are making phone calls before an incident, after an incident, and occasionally during an incident. Now, at least in DOC, those are recorded. And if you can get access to inmate phone call records, with the exception, of course, of attorney calls, that is sometimes excellent to establishing credibility, but then also getting a sense of the inmate's state of mind at the time and afterward. And then inmate infraction adjudication recordings, like we talked about. Basically, if an inmate engages in a jail infraction, let's say a fighting in jail, they actually have like a jail trial inside of jail with an adjudication captain. This is at least in New York City corrections. And then the information and statements that are made during that trial, including an officer submits a statement, an inmate gives a statement, can be very critical to understanding and establishing credibility. Radio transmissions, well, not quite as commonly, but basically, calling down to the intake for, additional officers, or an officer going out EMS, radio transmission could be helpful. Facility investigation documents. Obviously, the facility, usually if there's a use of force, and depending, of course, on the jurisdiction, the facility will conduct one. Whatever you're conducting, they're also conducting one on some level. So if you can get access to those documents, that can obviously be very important for both statements and various other things, and staff reports. So if staff are writing reports about what happened, obviously similar to an arrest report or memo book entries, that is very important. And staff reports are going to be, if they're accessible to you, you should definitely try and get them. So standard types of evidence, obviously. Now, about thinking creatively, this goes back to you have potentially access to more information, especially if it's video. Video is an example, but an example of thinking creatively. So the standard way of thinking might be, okay, so I get a video of the incident. Obviously, that's not rocket science. Video of the inmate and the video before, minutes before. So, okay, so 2 minutes before he was doing X. Video minutes after, of course, and escort to the intake. So intake is basically the port of entry into most facilities, at least in DOC, where the inmates who are brought to the facility going through the intake, which is, not exactly a housing area, but it's like a holding area. Or if they're going to another facility or a court, they'll go out the intake. So inmates come in and out. It's a high traffic area. So if there's video of a fight that's occurring beforehand, that's relevant, obviously. That's a little bit more relevant than possibly you would normally think. Sorry, right here. And other video that could potentially be relevant, video of officers after the incident, for example. Okay, that makes sense. Video of the intake, video of officers responding to go to the incident. So in most jail facilities in DOC anyway, if there's an incident that happens in a housing area, say use of force, there's going to be officers that respond to provide support to the officers in the area. Usually it's called a probe team in this particular scenario, but they respond usually from the intake. So if they're responding from the intake, you can have video of the intake of this responding. So why would this be relevant? You have situations in which if somebody's responding from the intake, somebody's responding from the intake, let's say you have on the use of force, you have somebody with helmet number 63. If they're sharing tactical gear, you have helmet number 63 floating around in this incident. You don't know It was assigned to helmet number 63. However, if you have video of the intake with officers suiting up in the intake and then going, you now have a face that goes to helmet number 63. This is the other evidence you can use that goes a little bit beyond just the incident. Or video outside of the intake decontamination. In New York City Corrections, if somebody is pepper sprayed, more or less, they have to have the pepper spray washed out of the rats. It's part of the regulations. There's a room in the intake where that is done, like a shower room. You may not have video inside there, but you have video outside of there. How long did it take to somebody get to decontamination? Did they get decontaminated at all? You can have video outside the decontamination room, for example. Or video of the inmate's escort from the intake to be rehoused. The overall point is, don't think just video of an incident, or even multiple shots, multiple angles of this incident, which goes without saying. It's basically, you could have way more things that give way more evidence on a much larger scale, and that's important to consider. Over-collect, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because it's relatively simple. An example of over-collection, that concept of just collect everything, not just thinking creatively over-collecting. Like if an inmate was involved in use of force on the bridge between two housing areas, right? You have different things you can collect. The use of force resulted in inmate and officers both being hospitalized, inmates in critical condition. What logbooks do I need? Let me think about this. Well, really all of them. Every logbook, every potential logbook. You have housing area logbooks, you have injury report logbook, who was actually injured at the same time, who was in the clinic at the time. If somebody went out EMS, you'll have information about reportable incidents, non-reportable incidents. If there was a fight that precipitated this, a fight logbook. Inmate went out, right? Transit logbook, control room logbook. These are information that you want. And rather than thinking, I only need the housing area logbook because it happened in the housing area, or I only need the A side, not the B side, if the housing areas are split, you need both, and you need everything that happened documented in every place you went after that, inmate and staff. So basically the principle is over collect, because going back to get that later is not something you want to do. You want to basically get it out of the gate if you can. So over collect is a major principle in any investigation, but definitely in corrections, because everything is documented in a very extensive way. Now, I mentioned evidence challenges that you're going to run into, which are, pretty straightforward, but they're pervasive. So they're important to talk about. So inmates participants often don't want to participate. So basically the thing is, the complainant witness is often not interested in being involved because for a variety of reasons. So refusal to provide statements is pretty common. Okay, so this is something you have to know going in that you're going to have to deal with. And there's different ways to get past that. Number one is probably explaining why you're there, not over-promising anything, and making sure you understand why the refusal is happening. And usually don't take that first refusal, because that first refusal is a little bit of a probe to see what this is about. So knowing that before you go there can help prepare you. Involved inmates, witnesses, and staff know each other, interact frequently before and after an incident. So basically collusion, like collusion or group statements, secondhand eyewitness accounts, like Jen was talking about, are a little bit difficult because people live together. They go back and interact with each other. That's very common. And then failure to participate for fear of retaliation from staff. That's common because I'm going to see this guy later. We live in the same building, more or less. Forced incidents involve frequently occurring sharing living spaces in high traffic areas. Basically, if it happens in the day room and there's a bloody shirt there, there's somebody whose job is literally to clean this area every hour. That shirt's going to be gone pretty soon. So it presents challenges for preservation of evidence, even if nobody is doing anything nefarious. Inmates involved in altercations with inmates or staff before or after use of force incident. It's hard to figure out what the source of injury is. If basically people involved in incidents before, during, and after, identifying the source of injury is tough. So anticipating these challenges and understanding that you have to think about them going in and think about the alternatives that you can use to get past them is helpful. And if you don't think about that first, you're going to run into them and have no other recourse because you only get one crack at it most times. I'm going to broaden the scope of analysis, which is kind of the last one here. Pretty decent amount of time. So basically the incident happens, right? And you have to determine what is the most likely theory of the case. So testing your theories of the case, not only yours, but other people's, is going to be pretty important, largely because you have more information with which to potentially test it in a correction environment than you do otherwise, as we talked about before. So the principle is that, when you analyze, especially with respect to the source of injury, your analysis is stronger when you consider alternative theories and impartially consider them and test them to determine whether they can be disproven. And you test your conclusions and competing theories of the case to bolster analysis, meaning you consider other theories of the case first. The benefit sometimes is if you get staff reports or a staff account first, you get their account before you talk to the inmate is ideal, right? But also if you have other inmate statements, you can figure that out also, basically from a facility investigation. But you also determine what you would expect to see if any of these different theories of the case are true. So you stress test those theories to determine whether or not they actually make sense, because you can take them through to their logical conclusion most times with additional evidence or more information. So for example, for source of injury, the source of injury can come from different places, obviously, but one of them could be the use of force itself. obviously. That's basically the original theory that, let's say, the inmate is putting forward. But it can also be incurred during an altercation prior, an altercation following. It could be intentionally self-inflicted, which sounds like, wow, that's crazy. Like, definitely can be intentionally self-inflicted in a variety of cases. It can be incurred through accidental contact with objects outside of camera view. Cell sting, for example, a wall, a floor, or incurred during arrest or transport to the facility. So this happened during the police arrest, and he actually had that black eye before he even got here. So sources of injury is a good example because they can come from a variety of places. So an alternative theory example would basically be, let's say, inmate says, he told me he was coming to my cell to mess me up. They opened the door, he ran in and started punching me in the head. Okay, so the injury is an orbital swelling and a forehead laceration, and the officer's punch to the face is the source according to the inmate. There's no video in the cell. So the officer's theory of the case was a little bit different. The inmate took a shiny object from his mattress, moved to cut himself. I entered to prevent him from harming himself. As he put the object in his mouth, he kicked me and then hit his head on the cell sink. So injury is the same: orbital swelling, forehead laceration, source, head strike on the cell sink, none in the cell. He said, she said, no video. However, we can take these theories through to the logical conclusion. So you think about, what would I expect to see if this was true, right? Obviously, corroborative eyewitnesses. Did anybody else see this? In a cell setting, the cells across from me are most likely to be able to see because we cross this little tier area, you can basically see across the hallway. Corroborative ear witnesses who possibly heard this verbal interchange that happened before him, which could be the cells next to him, or the floor officer or the control officer if they're on the floor and they can actually hear or see this. Search of the inmate's cell. You said he had a shiny object, right? So presumably, if you got it from his mattress, you'd want to search the rest of the cell, right? So there should be evidence of a search for contraband. A strip search. You said he put it in his mouth. You want to strip search him, obviously. Isolation cell. If he put it in his mouth, he didn't see it come back out, he'd have to pass it eventually, put him in an isolation cell. You would expect that behavior if you believe that the actual weapon is in the mouth. Mental health referral. You mentioned self-harm. He was trying to cut himself. Did the mental health referral happen? If not, that might undermine your theory of the case. And infractions and rearrest consistent with the reported offenses. Basically, did you basically go through the procedures that you would do if this person was actually doing these things? Contraband and rearrest, for example, for assault on staff. So these are the types of things you think about to basically stress test your analysis and somebody else's account to determine not only did it happen this way based on consistency, corroboration, or whatever, but you know jail rules in this situation, you can extrapolate that out. So did you do all these things you were supposed to do, which is consistent with your story? Or from the inmate's perspective, is anybody corroborating what you're saying? Yes, but basically, are your actions afterward consistent with what you're saying? So these are kind of the situations that are not totally different from police investigations, but you have potentially more information which would to corroborate based on procedures and the environment. So I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm just going to go through just quickly summary and recap. So the key things in corrections, you have to understand the environment, obviously. I reiterated that many times. What is going on here? How is this place set up? And what are the rules and regulations governing it? Establish the lead up. You have to go back far, understand what the interaction between these people are because they live together more or less, and get more evidence of that if you can. Broaden the scope of evidence. Don't just think the video of this minute, think of the video 3 weeks ago, video in the intake, or what logbooks you're going to get, all of them. They were moving through the facility. You could literally track their progress through the facility in books as it's written. And broaden the scope of the analysis. Because you know all these rules in the environmental situation, you know what should happen. If you described it this way, you know what should happen after. If it didn't, that may or may not undermine your theory of the case. You have to look at these things. So hopefully this is helpful for correction investigations especially. I know we moved through this kind of quickly, but basically the concept is there are similarities, there are differences, but the main difference is the context and how you think about evidence and the environment and the people in it. So with that, I will give it back to Cami, and thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And the session was so full of information. I really appreciate the two of you taking the time today to share all of this with the oversight community. We may have time for a couple of questions here. And so I wanted to start with, is it the position that the interviews that are being done are witness interviews and that the officers are not being treated as suspects?
Daniel, go ahead.
There, I think you're unmuted now, Jennifer. Wait, hold on. Hold on. I think now you're muted. Okay, can we hear you? No.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. So yeah, so I mean, ultimately, you know, when we are interviewing officers who are subjects of allegations, we interview witness officers as well. There's due process, so certainly we are going to be confronting them with the allegations as well. But our interviews are conducted the same way with everyone. We give everyone the opportunity to have an uninterrupted narrative. We ask follow-up questions. We ask them to tell us their version of events.
Thank you for that. Also, it was said that the best way to interview is to ask for a detailed narrative first when the interviewee gives a narrative, and then ask questions from there. Intuitively, this makes sense, and I know it's the best way, but is there a resource or standard that says this is the best way to conduct an interview?
That is a great question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. I know that Saul Casson, for example, who has done a lot of work on false confessions, says that this is the best way to conduct an interview. I know there are other studies. Off the top of my head, I cannot name them. But yeah, I mean, it is considered by many to be the best practice and the best way to facilitate people telling their story.
Great, thank you. And then I think this is a question that has come through many times. Is it possible to get copies of your slides from both of you? Great. Well, then I will, just so the audience knows, and for all of those that asked that question, I will work on getting those slides from our presenters, and we'll send those out in a follow-up email to all of you following today's presentation. So with that, I think that we are out of time, unfortunately, for today. I want to again extend my appreciation to Jermaine and Jennifer for sharing their knowledge with us today. I also want to thank Dan for bringing us this session today, and all the members of the Training, Education, and Standards Committee who have worked diligently this year to make the 2021 webinar series a reality. For those of you who have not already registered for the in-person component of the 2021 annual conference that Dan mentioned earlier, the deadline is quickly approaching. The event will take place December 12th through the 16th in Tucson, Arizona, and the deadline to register is December 7th. There is no on-site registration this year. We are already working on the 2022 webinar series, and we'll have sessions beginning in January, so please watch your inbox to register for our next event. Thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you again.